Welcome to Introduction to Educational Research. Today's video will deal with the functions of and the types of educational research. Well, the objectives are to list and discuss the four functions of educational research. First function is basic research. Second function is applied research, evaluation research, and action research. Second objective, to present an overview of the various types of educational research. And the third objective is to compare and contrast the qualitative and quantitative approaches to research methodologies. Well, in terms of the functions, let's start out with basic research. Basic research involves the process of collecting and analyzing information to develop and to create theories or to enhance theories, to expand on theories. And it's your sort of stereotypical horn-rimmed glasses, white lab coat scientists in a lab watching rats run around mazes and things like that. Very strict lab conditions and very strict control of variables. And basic research is not really concerned with the social utility of what they find. And it might be years before anything that is discovered in basic research actually trickles down and has some applications in education. Also included in basic research is the development of new products. The development of new products, not just theories. And some examples are classic examples of basic research in terms of education is the early work of B.F. Skinner and the behaviorists and applied behavior analysis. You know, I think this is a true story. When the Second World War was coming to an end, both the Axis and Allied powers were rushing to create guidance systems on missiles because they had missiles with weaponry attached to them. But they were very, very erratic. The guidance systems were very erratic. And they would fire them and there would be no way of knowing where they were going to land. Well, Skinner, I think this is correct, wrote a paper to the Department of Defense outlining his theory and outlining his experiments on using pigeons. And he claimed that he could create a guidance system using pigeons that would deliver a payload, a weapon payload, within 10 meters of the target. And of course, the Defense Department didn't pay any attention to him. And so who knows if it would have worked or not. But that's an example of basic research. Piaget and his work on developmental psychology with children is another good example of basic research. So basic research, again, is designed to develop or expand theories and to discover new knowledge. Applied research, on the other hand, its goal is to take the theories that have been developed by basic research and to test them out in real life in applied settings, like classrooms or education or social work or in psychology. And it supplies data that supports, guides, or revises theories developed by basic researchers. And it's designed to solve current educational problems and takes a look at what works and what doesn't work. And you can take a look at the graphic here. It talks about basic research and then applied research. Okay, the third function of research is evaluation. And basic and applied research are interested in developing theories and then taking these theories out into applied settings, in our case, educational settings, and putting the theories to test to see if they're working. And evaluation research is interested in making decisions about quality, effectiveness, or the value of educational programs or products or practices. And the focus is on making decisions about effectiveness and not not on the development of new knowledge. Evaluation research is not interested in developing new knowledge. And there is formative evaluation research, which monitors the ongoing progress of a program, product, or practice. So while the actual program or product is being used as ongoing evaluation, that's formative evaluation. And summative evaluation research is judging the overall impact of a program, product, or practice when it has been implemented and it is completed. And that's evaluation research. And the final function of research is the action research model. And it uses the scientific approach and scientific methodology to solve local problems. And it's research that is done by teachers for teachers. In fact, you will probably use an action research model in your thesis or your master's field project. It's a systematic inquiry into one's own teaching also. In fact, I just received an email from a student I had 1 year ago who just completed her master's thesis. She did a thesis, a scientific study in her classroom, and she used a piece of software that I had developed. And I won't bore you with the software or anything like that, but she used the software to evaluate her own teaching. And so this was a systematic inquiry into her own teaching. And she did a wonderful job. It was a really nice thesis. Now, I would suggest that you read chapter 1 in your textbook, and you will see that there are many, many different models for action research, but they all have basically the same thing. The identification of a problem, the development of a plan, acting on the plan or implementing the plan, observing and collecting data on how the plan is working out, and then reflecting and evaluating and revising the plan if necessary. And that's the action research model. And again, you probably will use some form of this in your master's thesis or your field project. So those are the functions of educational research. There's basic research, applied research, evaluative research, and then action research. Now, we're going to take a look at the big picture, the overall picture of the types of educational research. And don't get blown away by this. There are many different types, and we will go over the ones that are relevant and most important for you. So we have here types of educational research. Now, there are two basic, actually there are three, but pictured here are just two of the major scientific paradigms or ways of answering and asking questions. One is called the quantitative research methodologies, and all of these are quantitative research methodologies. The other is called the qualitative research methodologies, and all of these are considered qualitative research methodologies. And on the next screen, we will discuss quantitative and qualitative research methodologies. Just let me say this. Quantitative research methodologies generally are scientific studies that collect data and report their data in terms of numbers, whether it's just descriptive statistics or whether like mean, median, and mode, and the range and standard deviation, or whether it's inferential statistics where inferences are drawn and there are hypotheses and hypothesis testing. So that is the quantitative research methodologies. The qualitative research methodologies are quite different. They are not interested in numbers and in collecting and counting. They are interested in creating narratives and understanding the social situation that they are looking at. But we'll go into this much in the next screen. For now, on the quantitative research methodologies, we have experimental research methodologies and non-experimental research methodologies. experimental research methodologies. There are true experimental research methodologies. There are quasi-experimental research methodologies, and there are pre-experimental research methodologies. And again, don't worry about these right now. Just be aware that there are different kinds. And in fact, if any of you do a thesis, you will probably do a quasi-experimental or a pre-experimental, use a quasi-experimental or pre-experimental research methodology. Then there is a whole series of what are called single case research designs. Now, these are not single case. It doesn't mean there's just one subject, but they're referred to as single case research designs. And we have listed here 5 different research designs. One is called an AB design. In fact, if you read the Condom article about the 3 gay bars in Alaska, they used an AB design. And there is a multiple baseline design, a multiple probe, changing criterion, and multi-element design. And you will learn about these as the need arises for you to learn about them. So that's the experimental research designs, and they are all under the quantitative research methodology. Then we have non-experimental research designs. That is descriptive research is one. Descriptive research is like describing a situation right now, how it exists. It's like taking a photograph. When I was in the Department of Special Education back at a university on the East Coast and teaching, I had an undergraduate research group, and we were interested in the verbal interaction patterns of professors of higher education in graduate and undergraduate classes. I had developed a piece of software, and I won't bore you with it, but that could track that. That could track the verbal interaction patterns between professors and students. And what we did is we took about 250 hours of videotape of all different kinds of classrooms, graduate and undergraduate, not just in the School of Education, but throughout the entire university. And then we coded and we got all the results and found out what verbal behaviors look like. Actually, at this, our sample showed that professors talk about 75 to 80% of the time, and you all just sit around and listen. It's sort of a spectator sport from your perspective. And when you talk about 10% of the time. And when you do talk, 9% of your talk is in response to questions asked by professors. Only about 1% is behavior that you initiate. Well, anyway, so that was a piece of descriptive research. We were describing what the verbal interaction patterns look like. There's correlational research that will correlate different correlations between the weather and how you dress, or the diameter of a tree and the height of a tree, and correlations, relationships between variables. There's survey research, which you're very familiar with, and then there is what is known as causal comparative research, or sometimes it's referred to as ex post facto, and I won't bore you with that. It is exactly the same as true experimental research, except that the researcher cannot manipulate the independent variable, and that doesn't make much sense to you now, I don't think. Let me give you an example. If a researcher was interested in studying the effects of preschool attendance on reading ability at the end of 3rd grade, what the researcher would do was get reading scores at the end of 3rd grade for a group of a sample of students, and then see who attended preschool and who didn't attend. That's quasi-experimental. It's not true experimental, because if true experimental, the researcher would have beforehand assigned students, okay, you go to preschool, you don't go to preschool. And at the end of 3 years, then get those same students and get their reading scores. But that would be unethical. So it's called quasi-comparative. Don't worry about that though. All right, now the qualitative research methodologies, totally different paradigm, totally different paradigm. Ethnography. So was it Joan Goodall who spent all of those years with the gorillas, observing them, doing an ethnography, finding out what their culture was like, what they were like? So that's qualitative. Phenomenological research, case study, and grounded theory. These are interactive. Non-interactive, historical critical analysis. So again, we're going to now take a look at the difference between these two broad paradigms, quantitative and qualitative. Pardon me. I guess if you picture this, the Zen master and his student are walking across a bridge, and the student says, they walk across a bridge over a river, and the student says, oh, master, tell me about the river. Well, if the Zen master were into the quantitative research methodologies, he probably would take the temperature of the water, take the alkaline or acidity of the water, all kinds of physical measurements about the rate of flow, how quickly the water is flowing, all kinds of things like that. The quantitative, if the Zen master was from the quantitative school or methodology, he would pick the student up and throw him in the water. And the goal or the idea is to understand the river. You have to become part of the river. All right, so let's take a look at the differences between these quantitative research methodologies and qualitative research methodologies. And we'll look at them in terms of their approach, their purpose, their focus, their plan, their research plan, and their data analysis. Well, the quantitative research methodologies are deductive in nature. They work from the top down. So there's a theory. So a basic researcher, let's say, has come up with a theory. They create some hypotheses. They collect data to test these hypotheses, and then they, using inferential and descriptive statistics, they either confirm or reject the hypotheses. So it works from the top down, whereas the qualitative is totally opposite. It works from the bottom up. It starts out by just a series of observations, no hypotheses, no questions, well, some questions or ideas, and it collects data, and then it looks at this data in terms of what kinds of patterns are developed. And then it comes to some tentative hypotheses. And then it may, on the basis of these tentative hypotheses, develop a theory. But this works totally different. This works from the bottom up. In the 70s, early 70s, in Chicago, at the University of Chicago, there was an Episcopal minister named Claude Humphreys, I believe his name was. By the way, the University of Chicago at that time was very big into qualitative research. They were one of the leading universities, I believe. Well, anyway, he was an Episcopal minister, and he was pastor to a community that had a large percentage of gay parishioners. And so he became very interested in the problems and difficulties that his gay parishioners had. And from counseling them and talking with them, he found out that heterosexual or self-identified heterosexual and homosexual men tend to congregate in public bathrooms to have sex. And so this became very interesting to him. So he decided to do his doctoral dissertation on this. Well, how do you do a scientific study on heterosexual and homosexual men who meet in private bathrooms to have sex? Well, he couldn't do a quantitative study, he couldn't take a survey or anything like, well, I mean, he could, but you probably would not get any valid answers from that. So what he did is he decided to do a qualitative piece of research and started out with observations. So he showed up in public bathrooms around Chicago for 2 years. What he did find out, which made this a little simpler for him, is that for a homosexual act to take place in a public bathroom between two individuals, you need 3 people. And the third person is referred to as the watch queen, the watch queen. So he started to go to bathrooms and he'd hang out, and people might proposition himself, but he just stood there. And so eventually he became identified as a watch queen, and so became trusted. And so he was able then to collect all kinds of data. 2 years of collecting data. In fact, his doctoral dissertation is a fascinating book. He has diagrams of all the bathrooms and the patterns and how they walked around, and interesting things came out. He discovered a lot of things. A couple of things: there were never any talking goes on in these situations, always done by gesture and eye inflection and things like that. Anyway, that's a piece of qualitative research methodology. He immersed himself in that subculture so that he could understand it. Okay, so now back to let's look at the purpose. The purpose of quantitative is theory testing, prediction, establishing facts, and hypothesis testing, testing hypotheses. The purpose of qualitative is describing multiple realities, developing deep understanding, capturing everyday life and human perspectives. So it's a very, very different purpose here. The focus for quantitative, isolate variables, uses large samples and usually random, is often anonymous to participants, collects data using tests and formal instruments. For qualitative, it's quite different, the focus. The researcher is looking at the full context, and the researcher interacts with participants, collects data face-to-face from participants. The research plan, in quantitative, the research plan is developed before the study is even initiated, and it's structured and its proposal is formal. In the qualitative, it begins with an initial idea that evolves as the researcher learns more about participants and settings. And it's very flexible and changes as the researcher is collecting more data and continually analyzing it. The shift changes from one direction to another, and it's fine-tuned. Now, data analysis, as we said, is usually statistical with descriptive and inferential statistics for the quantitative. And it's mainly interpretive, descriptive, with extensive narratives for the qualitative. So these are 2 entirely different paradigms, entirely different ways of gaining information about a topic. Now, most of the large research that goes on now, that is federally funded with big grants, uses a combination of the quantitative and qualitative. You get a much richer look at the landscape, at the research landscape, if both paradigms are used. Well, okay, let's move right along. Now it is your turn. Here you have some questions, a function. So here you have the 4 functions of research: basic, applied, evaluative, and action. A function of this type of research is theory generation. So you would select A, B, C, or D. So you can put this into a Word document and answer those. And then, so you could put the video on pause and do that. Then on the next screen, you're asked to do the same, only here you have to distinguish between quantitative research methodology and qualitative research methodology. And that's it. These are the resources that were used during the preparation of this. I apologize for any typos. I used to edit a magazine, and getting to be 100% with no mistakes is an extremely difficult. Well, okay. Thank you very much, and we will see you next time.